In class and in the previous art fix, we were looking at monuments to Roman military victories. We remember from class that the breastplate worn by Augustus in the Prima Porta statue commemorates the victory in the Parthian War, where the Parthians are now surrendering and handing back this Roman military standard to a personification of Rome. The Areopagus, on the other hand, as we saw in the last art fix, celebrates the Pax Romana, the era of peace that was ushered in when Augustus, in a different battle, defeated Spain and France. The rest of this art fix will look at other monuments to imperial military victories following in the footsteps of Augustus. For example, this monument in Rome, this column, commemorates the victory of Trajan, the Emperor Trajan, over the people of Dacia, the Dacian Wars. There are actually two of these, 105 and 101, and a renewal of hostilities in 106 AD. Trajan led the troops up the Danube River in Central Europe into what is today Romania. This is a major victory. It's probably his most prominent military victory. He brought over 500,000 pounds of gold back to Rome. Also took 500,000 prisoners. 10,000 of these prisoners were sent to the city of Rome to fight in gladiatorial games, because after defeating the Dacians, Trajan sponsored 123 days of celebration at the Colosseum, where many of these prisoners were in fact put into battle, gladiatorial battles. So the column commemorates this same military victory, and the column shows both victories in one continuous band that wraps around the column on 22 different tiers. And it's pretty much equally split between the first and the second Dacian War. But it's all told in 155 different scenes with over 26,000 figures carved to tell this elaborate story. Because it's one continuous band, Trajan himself appears a great number of times. In fact, 58 different times Trajan can be seen in the action as we wrap our way around the column and read it toward the top. The figure at the top that you see over here on the left was originally Trajan himself, but this was replaced with St. Peter by one of the popes in the Renaissance in the 16th century AD. Now, as you might imagine, it's fairly hard to read from the ground. This was taken on your right with a telephoto lens. But originally, the column of Trajan stood between two libraries, two buildings, that were erected at the exact same time as the column and were intended as viewing platforms for the column. So the small figures that you see here could actually be read fairly well from the upper stories of those buildings that surrounded the column of Trajan. Now, each of the two campaigns, and we're not going to go through all 155 scenes, but each of the two campaigns begins with the Romans crossing water to attack their enemies. And again, I think this is meant as a metaphor for moving away from Rome. In this case, we see them actually crossing a bridge that they've built that's over a river. They're the boats on the river. And in fact, this is meant to be the Danube River, and we see it personified as a figure here beneath the bridge as the Romans now exit the gate to move onward in their battle. So again, in typical Roman fashion, the Danube River is shown as a personification of a human figure that represents the river itself. It's important to remember as we look at some of these scenes that this is not necessarily an accurate retelling of the events. Of course, the river personification heralds this. But more important than that is it shows the entire battle from a Roman standpoint, from a Roman point of view. The way they want it to be remembered, not the way it actually was. And so in many ways, the column of Trajan exists as a form of Roman propaganda. This is us, these are our enemies, this is how we defeated those enemies. As you might imagine, with these thousands of figures and hundreds of scenes, it has a typical Roman attention to detail. And it shows significantly more than just the battles. For example, it shows many of the mundane aspects of war, like building fortifications. And here we see the figures hauling stones and marshaling their forces, putting aside their shields, carrying things on their back, and simply erecting the fortifications necessary in order to stage this siege against the Danes. That doesn't mean that it skips on images of the brutality of battle, and we see one here from further up the column, where we can see that it's told in all of its horrific detail. This skirmish between the Romans and the Dacians. And what's interesting is that the Romans are not all beardless, which they normally are, and I think this is an attempt to show that the Romans themselves have quite a few different countries fighting with them, a coalition, if you will. But here we see them fighting against the Dacians over here, who are wearing pants. That helps to distinguish them. And you can see it's a fairly brutal and cruel scene, and in fact, right here you see there's a figure fighting against the Dacians, and he's holding the decapitated head of one of the Dacians in his teeth, grabbed it by the hair as if to perhaps scare off his colleague here. This will happen to you next. In the same scene, we see over on the left-hand side more images of decapitation. And here's a close-up of that battle. So there's the head and his teeth. And here we see more figures offering heads and showing them to, in fact, the Emperor Trajan here, who is reviewing the effects of the battle. Other images show scenes of torture. Here we see probably Roman women torturing Dacian prisoners, although it's been suggested that maybe they're Dacian women torturing Roman prisoners, which might make more sense to show the Dacians as evil. But you'll notice that they have them by the hair, they have them tied up, and they're actually burning them with torches. So the horrific elements of war are obviously plentiful here, many places to see them. But at the same time, it's all celebrated. All of this leads to a very glorious victory. And here is a personification of victory herself, the goddess of victory, Victoria, who's taking a group of shields, and she's inscribing honorific verses to the victory on these different sheets. Now, triumphal columns are not rare, but very few of them survive. Here's one erected by Marcus Aurelius, also in the city of Rome. But the most common type of triumphal monument was, in fact, the triumphal arch. This was a false city gate for the victorious emperor and his troops to enter through as they came back from battle, although sometimes they're commemorated quite a bit later. Titus was the son of Vespasian, the one who built the Colosseum, and this arch was erected by his brother, his younger brother, Domitian, after Titus had died. And as a memorial to his older brother, who's now dead, the inscription at the top says, devoted to the Divo Tito, the god Titus. And the Divi Vespasiani, this is the god Vespasian, because the Romans believed that the emperors became gods on their death. The arch was erected to commemorate Titus's primary military victory, and this was the victory in the Jewish wars of around 70 AD, where he conquered an uprising of the Jews in Palestine. And so this is in fact made specifically to commemorate that military victory. There are sculptures lining the walls on the inside of the archway. You can see a bit of one here, another area of it there, on opposite sides of the arch on the inside. And that's what we're going to focus on in your textbook. On one side, we see Titus's troops coming back to Rome from Jerusalem. And you can see that they've come from Jerusalem because they're carrying a massive silver menorah that they've stolen from the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. And they're bringing that and other spoils of victory back to Rome. Again, notice the differing levels of relief so that the foreground figure's head is in fact missing, whereas the background figures are carved in lower relief. This gives us a great sense of three-dimensionality and a great sense of depth beyond the simple depth of the carved surface. It's very pictorial. Also notice the military standards that the Romans are carrying. Certainly these was practice adopted from ancient Egypt, where we saw them on the Roman palette, or even as ancient Mesopotamia, where we saw them in things like the standard fort. Also notice how they enter into Jerusalem through a gateway. This is very much like the triumphal arch we're looking at. And it too comes out into space, higher relief on the leading edge as it falls into lower relief in the background, so as to look as if a very convincing sort of suggestion of three-dimensional space. So this is on one wall. We see the troops of Titus bringing back the spoils of war, things they had looted from Jerusalem on defeating the Jews. On the opposite side, we see Titus himself riding in the same direction as his troops. They're both moving to your left. And it's a little hard to read because of the state of preservation. Here's a 18th century reconstruction, which I think shows much more clearly exactly how it originally appeared. We see Titus in a chariot here, moving towards your left in a team of horses. You'll notice that here's a close-up. Titus is crowned with a wreath of honor, a wreath of victory, and is crowned by this winged figure in the background. That is again Victoria, just as we saw on the column of Trajan. And it's victory crowning Titus for his defeat of the Jewish people in Palestine. Directly in front of the chariot is a half-naked figure, rather built. This is another personification that the Romans love to use. He's meant to represent honor itself, and you'll notice that he's directing the horses, right? He's indicating to us and to anybody who looks on that this is Titus in victory, but Titus to be honored. The chariot is drawn by 4 horses. This is, of course, a quadriga that we talked about in class. And this, again, is meant to associate Titus, who's now passed away, with Apollo, the sun god. And in fact, that's certainly the case, that people believe that the emperors became one with the gods after their death. And since this is indeed after his death, there's no real problem with that. The horses are led by this female figure here, whose body is entirely broken away. In the original, this is an Amazon figure, and meant to be a symbol of strength, moving forward, and in many ways leading that team of horses, that quadriga. And again, notice this Roman interest in vibrant realism. Those horses are absolutely terrific. No two look exactly the same. And each of them has not only an intense realism, but also a sense of activity and vibrancy that is typical of Roman art.